Hello to all the Source ZeroCon attendees. I'd like to welcome you to the talk on the Nooks and Crannies of AppSec Programs, where we will explore components of an AppSec program that are either the last to be identified or sometimes never even considered, even within a mature application security program. I'll start with a little intro on who I am. My name is John Sangaris. I'm a demand and delivery manager with Optiv. I've been coding for about 39 years, starting on the Commodore VIC-20, back when you had to transcribe game code from a book into the computer in order to play those games. I've been coding professionally for about the last 25 years with a bit of system and network administration in there. I started doing some cybersecurity about 23 years ago, back in a startup where we wore multiple hats. My hats included incident response and server hardening. After the startup, I progressed to e-discovery and insider threat investigations. Since the development world kept pulling me back, I eventually became a security champion, then a security trainer. I managed vulnerability programs, did secure code reviews, and eventually got into application pen testing. But because I was a builder at heart, I would always gravitate back to AppSec programs because in the end, AppSec programs, you get to build constantly. Outside of my AppSec life, I geek out quite a bit. I've been in the Web3 space for a couple of years now as an NFT developer and development mentor, and I've written some white papers a couple of years ago about NFT project planning and ethics. I'm also an aspiring author, dropping a book this year. I'm doing a screenwriting for a web series that I'm hoping to start filming next year, and I do medieval fighting in the Society for Creative Anachronisms. The TLDR is I am a geek obsessed with AppSec, and I don't know why I did just say that. TLDR, I'm a geek obsessed with AppSec. That could have covered like the entire intro there. You're going to have to bear with me. Before we explore the nooks and crannies of AppSec programs, we're first going to talk about application development risk management, because that paradigm is what empowers us to start looking for these nooks and crannies outside of what is typically considered the standard controls for an AppSec program. The first nook we will look into will be secure software supply chain management in depth. I know I'm throwing a lot of words into that one, but they're all important and they're all relevant, as we will see in that section. Next, we will look at program telemetry. We often refer to these as KPIs and KRIs, but we're going to discuss further how the standard set of KPIs may not be the entire conversation when we're discussing what needs to be tracked. Following that, we're going to hit on application risk profiles and how they can positively affect your budget if you use those risk profiles to determine applicable security controls for that application. On that line, we will discuss how risk profiles can help increase your security and compliance through risk-based security training. Finally, we're going to end on asset end-of-life planning, which seems appropriate as a terminal topic. In this section, we're going to discuss some of the considerations and concerns of when an asset end-of-life event is triggered. I'll finish off by giving my recommendation on your next step and then answer any questions you have. So let's begin. Let's get a little philosophical here for a second. There are two aspects of life: doing the thing and protecting the thing. The protecting this part is where we're focusing our attention right now. So let's jump back to where all this started. In the beginning of humanity, a cave person wanted to make a bank deposit, and on the way to the bank, someone mugged them and took their money. This cave person then learned how to prevent the mugging and became the first risk management consultant, teaching people how to manage risk. Sometime along the way, we stopped using the word risk within application development and started using the word security. Part of the fallacy of this move is that security was more focused on the controls specific to the development of code. Many application security programs developed by organizations still focus only on code level controls. Over the years, industry has grown the focus from code level controls to full application security program frameworks. But even within these frameworks, we're still thinking in terms of security. The problem with this paradigm is that when we use security, the connotation is in a control that applies a direct effect to what we're trying to protect. When we use the term risk, it opens up our viewport to start exploring the edges of what comes into the realm of an application security program. There are other areas within an application security program that become apparent when we start thinking in terms of risk management. So let's look at a few of those areas. We're going to start with secure software supply chain management in depth. That's a hefty title. Often it's referred to as supply chain management, software supply chain, secure supply chain, and they're all correct because they're all referring to the same thing. Why we're starting with this component is because supply chain attacks are trending upwards in frequency. Attackers are realizing that the supply chain through third-party libraries is becoming an easier vector through which they can inject malicious code. Because of this, regulations requiring some kind of supply chain controls are also on the rise. Let's break down what secure supply chain management in depth actually means and why it's one of the nooks and crannies of an AppSec program. You've probably heard of SBOM, or Software Bill of Materials, as well as SCA, or Software Composition Analysis. Together, these controls focus on enumerating all the libraries that are directly or transitively included in your software, and then attempts to find all the vulnerabilities in those libraries, either directly by examining the code or referencing the library version against a national vulnerability database to determine if there are known vulnerabilities. To be fair, these are both very important controls. The part of the supply chain management that we're about to explore is usually most pertinent in highly regulated industries, the ones subject to AppSec program and code security audits. When we look at risk within the supply chain and then the standard methods of mitigating risk, such as transfer, avoid, reduce, or accept, we can see that there are other options beyond code level controls. I want to caveat what I'm going to say with the fact that I am not a lawyer, and any of the techniques that I mention are legal controls that directly relate to managing risk within AppSec. Without a shadow of a doubt, you should talk to your lawyer before you attempt to put any of these controls in place. As an example of a mitigation that goes beyond a code level control, you can use a popular and well-known contract clause with third-party vendors, which is the SLA, or Service Level Agreement. While you're testing your software, if you find a critical vulnerability in the third-party software, it's written into the contract that they have so many days to fix that critical level vulnerability and produce a new library version. The SLA is a pretty popular contract clause and security control. Most people are familiar with it. But taking this a step further, we can also add an attestation requirements clause within that contract. Will the vendor you're purchasing the library from attest that they're using certain level of security controls within their development environment? Obviously, this pertains more to COTS, or commercial off-the-shelf libraries, which are typically purchased from a vendor as opposed to open source libraries. But the considerations are the same. Is there an SLA with open source libraries? Who's responsible for security of that supply source? But I said we were looking at supply chain security in depth. What does in depth mean? Let's look at a little more complicated scenario where you purchase a library from vendor X and incorporated it into your application. During a pen test, the assessors find a critical vulnerability. When your developers chase down the location, they find that the vulnerability actually exists in this third-party library. You review your contracts and see that you indeed have an SLA that says the vendor X is responsible for fixing their code within 5 days of a critical vulnerability disclosure. You contact them to let them know, which triggers their internal development team to review the vulnerability. What they find is that the vulnerability isn't actually within their code, it's within a library that they're using from another third party. And because your contract stated that vendor X was responsible for fixing their own code, they're now off the hook because the vulnerability wasn't found in their code, it was found elsewhere, which leaves you in a pickle. Now, obviously, I'm pushing really far into the corners of what we can do as far as risk mitigation, especially in a hypothetical situation, which is precisely what I said I would do in the title. Now, whether you can enforce a clause in a contract that requires vendor X to attest that they have attestations and SLAs with their third-party company is completely up to the lawyers. But the point is, when we view supply chain management from a risk posture, we see that there are other controls beyond the ones that function at the code level that can be applied to positively affect not only your security posture, but your risk posture as well. Again, talk to your lawyers about this one. You should have both your security team and lawyers in your conversation if you find it's applicable to your maturity level and regulatory needs. Moving on to program telemetry. You've probably not heard it referred to as this before, as most AppSec programs refer to them as KPIs, key performance risk indicators, and KRIs, key risk indicators. The reason why I use the term program telemetry is because KPIs and KRIs are not descriptive enough to encompass the various levels of value and communication. Let's start off with the old adage that if you can't measure a thing, you can't manage a thing. If, in this case, the metrics that we want to gather have two functions, as with all metrics, to measure things we want to increase and to measure things we want to decrease. The question is, who is doing the measuring? Another question is, who is responsible for increasing or decreasing those tracked numbers? And does every person need to know every tracked number? Quite often, we use low-level metrics only within an application security program. Metrics such as number of vulnerabilities for an application. Now, this metric can tell us whether our vulnerabilities are trending higher or lower within an application. Obviously, this is one of those metrics we want to decrease. Altering your security tooling, people, or processes can cause your vulnerability trends to alter drastically. For instance, if you install a new SAST tool, whereas previously you didn't have one, that's going to cause your vulnerabilities to spike. But barring changes to your security pipeline, this number is going to tell you whether your security posture is increasing based on the number of vulnerabilities you have for this application. As engineers and engineering manager, this is an important metric that's going to give you the temperature of the secure quality of your code. However, at the director level, you may not want to see the day-to-day metrics of code quality. The KPIs you will more likely want to see are going to be more program level, tracking budgetary commitments against efficacy of tools, processes, and people. If you spend money on a person, process, or tool in order to elevate your security posture, the telemetry you're going to be more concerned with will be tracking the efficacy of your investment. And this doesn't just mean putting a new tool in the pipeline, let it run and hope it catches more vulnerabilities or finds them farther up the pipeline. At this point, you can do an almost scientific review of the efficacy of the control by seeing what the trend was before the implementation and what the trend is after the implementation. If you invest in a tool and you notice a spike in true positive vulnerabilities directly after implementing this tool, you know there was a benefit to it. If you implement a control and you don't see a spike in discovering new vulnerabilities, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's ineffective, but it may be an indicator. Finally, at the executive level, The metrics that will be most pertinent are going to be based on risk posture of the whole program as a whole. These type of metrics may include tracking the remediation rate and mean time to remediate of certain vulnerabilities. As an example, the AppSec program identified a vulnerability and then within X amount of time was able to remediate the problem before that problem became a production vulnerability. Metrics that translate into supporting ROI for an AppSec program will be the most useful at this level. Assigning metrics at all levels of an AppSec program is key in facilitating full maturity of a program. Before we get into security tasks, let's talk about application risk profiles. An application risk profile should be calculated as part of onboarding an application asset into your application portfolio management system. The risk profile is determined by multiple factors, including the criticality to your company, the type of data that's stored within that application, the exposure of that application, whether internal or external, as well as other factors. Identifying an application risk profile is a necessary component because it helps assign activities, effort, and budget spend according to risk-based needs. Let's explore this further. I had a client once that had $1 million pen testing budget for the year. However, because there were no risk-based guidelines for how the pen tests were assigned and executed, development teams requested a pen test per their existing SOP for every release to production. This meant that regardless of the criticality, regardless of the code change type, the development teams were able to request a pen test for every release, which meant the pen test as a control was applied indiscriminately to all releases for all applications. That $1 million budget lasted 3 months. That company went 9 months without the ability to pay for a pen test for any of their software releases. The reason this happened is because the company had not yet set up risk profile-based security controls. What exactly are risk profile-based security controls? They're security controls that are applied in the proportionate amount based on the application risk profile. Let's look at an extreme example to see how this works. You have 2 applications. One is your cafeteria menu application that has one login, and that person with the login changes the menu for the following week. All other users are non-authenticated users, and for all intents and purposes, they go to this web application and read this read-only menu. On the other end of the spectrum, we have a web application that houses nuclear codes. Please don't ask why the nuclear codes are being fed through a web application in this hypothetical, because they just are. Now, on its face, we can assign the cafeteria menu a risk profile level of 1, making some assumptions in our hypothetical situation that it's not critical to the company. If it were compromised, the total impact to the company would be possibly somebody misrepresenting the price of meatloaf next Thursday. Conversely, we all know that if nuclear codes got into the wrong hands, our planet could be destroyed by a nuclear war. So we're going to assign that program the highest profile level of 5. Now, we can probably all agree that both applications need some kind of SaaS tool, some automated scanning. In the end, if the cafeteria menu data gets compromised, that's not such a big deal. But if the application gets compromised, maybe it can be used in some social engineering attack or some other chain attack. So we need to find vulnerabilities during the development pipeline. What about a pen test? If we can only conduct so many pen tests a year based on our budget, where do we allocate those pen tests between those 2 applications? I think it's fairly obvious that we would favor pen tests more for the nuclear codes application. But unfortunately, many companies don't run their programs like that and evenly distribute their security codes controls. meaning they apply pen tests equally to all applications. Perhaps for the cafeteria menu application, we do a focus pen test, which only covers new features that are being developed. But for the nuclear codes application, we do full pen tests on every release. You can start seeing how allocating certain controls based on risk starts changing the nature of how your budget is applied based on that risk profile. Let's go to an extreme example. How many armed guards do you think we need to watch the terminal where the cafeteria manager has access and goes to enter next week's menu items and pricing? My guess is that 0 armed guards would be paid to watch that station. It is reasonable to expect that we're going to put armed guards around the nuclear codes terminal where somebody can come access nuclear codes. Armed guards are very expensive, especially if you're using 2 at a time, 24/7, 365 days a year for coverage. But protecting those codes would most likely be deemed worth the expense. In this case, and while it is an extreme control, for example purposes only, could you imagine if we applied that control equally to both applications? I'm guessing somebody may actually get fired over that type of allocation, where 50% of the armed guards are sent to the cafeteria menu terminal, and the other 50% are sent to watch the nuclear codes interface. Again, while that is an extreme example, companies do this frequently with many other controls that have a monetary or time cost to them, such as pen testing. What about security or secure code reviews? Can we expand and contract those based on the risk profile? What about threat modeling? Should a threat model be conducted on every release for every feature? Using risk profile-based security controls, we can start answering those questions. Perhaps for our cafeteria menu, we do focused secure code reviews, focused pen tests when a code change rises to a certain threshold. Perhaps we do focused threat models only on significant design changes. Conversely, we may do comprehensive code reviews and comprehensive pen tests on all changes in the nuclear code application, as well as periodic threat models and pen tests in production. Basing your security controls on your application risk profile is one of the fastest ways to align your budget spend with risk posture within your application security program. To continue our discussion of risk profile, another method of increasing your security posture for your applications is with education. Just like with program telemetry that appears at multiple levels in an application security program, security training can also fall within multiple levels of development. For instance, the director of an application security program could benefit from having some security training at a high level, which may familiarize them with what OWASP does, why there's a need for security within the development pipeline, and the major components of an AppSec program. Security training can also be provided to project managers. They may not need to know how to reproduce a vulnerability or how to describe the technical basis for that vulnerability, but it's important that they understand the life cycle of the vulnerability. How does that vulnerability get triaged? How does that vulnerability get placed back into the development life cycle? How do these get prioritized within the context of project management? But the guts of risk profile-based security training comes at the software engineering level. Training costs time and money, which really boils down to money and money. Borrowing from our previous example, the developers of our cafeteria application may not need any special security training at all. With such a low risk profile, that application may not warrant putting training requirements into the guidelines at all. Now, it's a recommendation that all developers should have some secure code training. But again, we're focused on where to spend the budget to affect the greatest increase in the risk posture of your program. As such, you can offer secure code training to cafeteria menu developers, but you can create a requirement for developers who work on the nuclear codes application to have that training. If you're going to participate in architectural designs for the nuclear codes app, they can take secure architecture and threat model training. If they're doing software design and coding, they can take threat model and secure coding training. Again, the purpose of risk-based allocation of resources is to, one, eliminate spending money on things that don't increase your risk posture, and two, to focus your spending on applying controls where they will make the greatest impact. Finally, we're going to talk about asset end-of-life planning. Industry has gotten very good at giving direction and guidelines on what you need to do with data once you're done with it. We have guidelines and regulations on data policy, data retention policies. We have best practices on how to store that data during that time it is dormant. In fact, most people have probably used the term data retention policy because it covers the fundamental of what we're trying to protect, which is information. However, more often than not, when I ask companies if they have an end-of-life plan for any given application, the answer is usually that they don't. Some companies have generic decommissioning processes for servers, but nothing specifically for an end-of-life event for an application. Now, some companies don't even foresee that an application would have an end-of-life, except 20 years later when something is rewritten faster and better, more maintainable, there's a big chance the old version is going to get decommissioned. Not having an asset end-of-life plan can open you up to risks that companies hadn't even thought about. I know a company whose execution of an end-of-life plan was closing port 80 and port 443 on their firewall, but they left their application running on the server indefinitely. I've seen companies leave their firewall open and simply turn off the web server. The problem with these two types of procedures are they don't take into account of what's left over and who has access to them. Remember, this isn't just an exercise in security, but an exercise in risk management. What's the risk of leaving an application that is no longer maintained and no longer monitored running on your internal network, even if you shut off access to the external internet? What happens with some of these legacy applications which have credentials stored on the file system and are simply turned off and left with no monitoring of who has access to that server? The risk increases in each one of these situations where there are bits and pieces of applications left over without proper handling. You can equate an end of life with your incident response. It would be foolish for a company to not have an incident response playbook. If you've suffered an attack and you are trying to figure out how to respond to that attack while you're responding to that attack, you increase the potential for your damage significantly because your response will be slow and haphazard. While an application end-of-life event may not be something that needs to happen at 2 a.m. in the morning in response to an emergency, not having a playbook for how you're going to decommission an application increases the risk that decommissioning leaves fragments of that application and that information vulnerable to compromise all over your network. So how does one even begin coming up with an end-of-life plan? First, you should start by onboarding your app into an application portfolio management system. As part of onboarding that application, you should create a RACI for the operations and development of that application, as well as a RACI for the end of life of that application. Sometimes those two teams that deal with operations and end of life are not necessarily the same. As well, the architectural documentation for that application should be referenced, and all components, be it systems, data, or network, should be identified, and each component should have a plan for either decommissioning or archiving. You are literally building the reverse of a migration to production checklist. where migration production may include provisioning a new server, configuring that server to host the application, installing the application, setting up a network with the appropriate routes and segmentation, opening firewall ports in order to allow traffic to that application, installing a database, setting up more routes so the various tiers of the application can talk to each other, and the myriad of tasks that go into putting this application into production the first time. All those steps need to be either reversed or accounted for in the asset end-of-life plan. Furthermore, it's not simply a matter of deleting all these pieces from existence. Consider what kind of retention policy is needed. Do you have steps for re-provisioning this application sometime in the future? Data retention regulations can have you storing data for years based on your jurisdiction. I don't know about anybody else, but I've seen JPEGs directly on the file system before. I've read the contents, and I can't interpret what a JPEG looks like when I'm reading it directly on the file system. I need some program to interpret that data for me so it makes sense. So I can keep the JPEG for 7 years, but it does me no good if I don't have the ability to interpret that data if it needs to be viewed again in the future. Likewise, many applications have databases full of information that can only be interpreted and potentially decrypted using the algorithms within that application. So if you have a 7-year data retention policy for what's in the database, and in 5 years, some legal event triggers requiring the company to read that data, how are you going to read it without that application? These are some of the risks, albeit at times small, that are often overlooked when we do our application asset onboarding. So what's next? It's important to understand that there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all application security program. Your development landscape and your company's goals will be the biggest drivers of what type of application security program you build. But if you only take one thing away from this presentation, I hope you take away this, because fundamentally this paradigm is how you start identifying all those nooks and crannies of an AppSec program. Application security is a function of risk management. And while we will always continue to use the term application security program because that is what the industry knows and that is what the industry identifies with, you would be much better served, at least for the paradigm, to think of it as an application risk management program. Just reframing how you view the program will enable you to start thinking holistically about your program and the effects of the event investments in the people, processes, and tools to the risk profile of the organization at large. That concludes this talk. I will be available in Discord for any questions. If you are so inclined, you can find me online, mostly on Twitter, under my nom de plume, Johnny Renaissance. Thank you for attending this talk, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Source Zero Con 2023.